Good evening, everyone. It's Thursday, November 21st, and I just got my first load of fig cuttings that I'm going to root this year in the mail today. They came at about 2 p.m., so they're very fresh. And what I'm going to show you right now is the direct potting method of propagating fig cuttings. I will be doing two different methods of fig propagating this year. I'll be doing the direct potting method and also the pre-rooting method as well. And the pre-rooting method takes a little bit more time, so I'll have a video on that later. So we'll just start with this, which is probably the most simple and straightforward method of propagating fig cuttings. So there I have 9 fig cuttings. They are 4 different varieties. And I want to show you everything that I have here that will be required to do this. Over there in the corner, I have a shot glass and a permanent marker, as well as a bottle of Clonex. And next to the bottle of Clonex is also, these are 18-ounce clear Solo cups that I got from Walmart for something like $1.75 a package. Over here, I have the medium that I'm using. You'll see Miracle-Gro Perlite, that is to add drainage to the potting soil. This is basic potting mix from Walmart. It was about $5 for the bag. And then over here I have pine bark mini nuggets that I will be using as a mulch to keep things moist so I don't have to continually add water as the season goes. Then over here I have on the left in this roasting pan, I have my potting mix from Walmart, and I have in the roasting pan on the right, I have the pine bark mini nuggets. And the reason why they're in a roasting pan is because I bake them in my oven at 300 degrees for 1 hour to kill off any kind of fungus gnat or any other parasitic larvae that may be in the medium. And that's completely unnecessary. You don't have to do that. The reason why I'm doing that is because I will be keeping the fig cuttings upstairs in my office, and it's the warmest room in the house. That's why they'll be in the office. And I don't want a fungus gnat bloom to happen in my office where I work every single day, because that would drive me insane. If you're keeping this in some kind of closet and you don't mind if there's a bit of a fungus gnat problem at some point, you don't have to bake your soil. It's an added step, and it is a pain in the neck to do. So now that I've outlined everything here, I want to discuss with you how to go about doing this. When you receive your fig cuttings, the very first thing you need to do is cut and sanitize your fig cuttings. As I mentioned, these just came today in the mail. So down here I have 4 different varieties. I have Pastelliere, Maltese Beauty, Long de Doute, and Negra de Arde. And the first thing I did was I took a clean pair of cuttings and I sheared off at the bottom node of each fig a 45-degree angle cut. So when I say nodes, each of these different growth points are nodes. So here is a node here where you see a growth line in the cutting, and this is a node here where you see a growth line in the cutting. And in each of these nodes, you'll see there are 2 bumps. The bottom bump right here, the larger one, is where a fig once grew, but it has since been picked. The top is where a bud would grow out if a new branch were to come out of here. So there's a double bump on each node. The lower bump is the fruit. The top bump is a branch. So when I originally got this fig cutting, growers tend to cut exactly in the middle of the node because it's easier. And that's not really what you want to do. So initially the cut was right here, and there was probably about this much hanging off this cutting on the very bottom. What I did was I cut it very high up top. And the reason why I did that is all due to hormones. And this is my theory right here. When a tree is in its growth phase and it is actively growing, the hormones come from the root and they move to the top of the tree. The sap is flowing up during the growing season. And all growers know, at least all good nursery owners and people that prune trees, they know when you want to encourage branching, you head right above a node to create branching. So if I wanted to branch this fig tree, if this was a fig tree growing in the ground and I wanted it to branch out in all different directions, I would make my cut right here. very, very close to the node, and that is going to encourage branching, because as the sap flows up the tree, you want it to hit that node and you want it to immediately start branching out. You don't want the hormones to run up here and say, oh, there's nothing going on here, we have to move down to the nearest node and then commit to branching. That's not what you want to do. Well, the same thing happens when you are trying to root cuttings, but in reverse, in my opinion. In wintertime, in dormancy, the sap flow is not happening. There isn't sap flowing up the tree. The sap instead collects at the bottom, so it's heading down towards the roots. So if this cutting ended down here, and this is where I made my cut, I need roots to come out of this node. Well, if all the sap is collecting down here, I'm going to have trouble getting a node way up here to branch out. So you'd want to make the cut very close to that node so the sap flow all collects down here and at the root nodes, so that'll encourage roots to grow. So the first thing I did was I took my clean shears, and on every single one of these cuttings, I cut just below the node on a 45-degree angle. After I made all of my cuts, I then sanitized all of my cuttings. What I did was I took an 8x8 brownie pan and I laid all of my fig cuttings in the brownie pan, and I filled it up with 2 parts water and then 1 part 3% hydrogen peroxide. So I made a diluted 3% hydrogen peroxide bath, and I mixed the cuttings around and I allowed them to sit in that bath for about 5 minutes. After I was done letting them sit in the bath for 5 minutes, I took them out and I put them on my drying rack to dry. Now that we have cleaned and sanitized fig cuttings, we need to talk about the direction of the fig cuttings. Figs are in fact directional. You need to make sure that you don't stick your cuttings in the ground upside down or they will not grow properly. Now, when you take a cutting like this, it's very, very obvious to tell which way the cutting is. Here there is a clear bud at the top, so clearly you're going to insert your cutting into the ground like this. That's an easy one. Same thing with a cutting like this. This is a very thick fig cutting. It gets very narrow up at the top. This is clearly the base of the cutting. But what happens if you get a cutting like this? A cutting like this is about the same thickness on the bottom and on the top. So just looking at it, you can't really tell which way to place your fig cutting. So what you need to do is you need to look carefully at the node. When you look at the node of the fig cutting, it all becomes clear the direction that the fig cutting is. So here you'll see 2 bumps. The larger bump is the fruit, the smaller bump is the branch. And the branch always grows up and the fruit always grows down. So that means this is the bottom of the cutting and this is the top of the cutting. So I have it oriented correctly. You'll also see that the leaf node actually is angled up a bit. So that's telling you, stand me up this way. So this is the proper orientation of this cutting. If you were to flip it this way, you'd have a major problem on your hands because the branch would want to grow down and the fruit would want to grow up. And we all know that's impossible. The fig cannot hang up. Okay, now that our fig cuttings are cleaned, sanitized, and we know what direction to pot them, we're going to make our potting mix. Now if you want, you can just use straight out of the bag potting mix. I'm going to add perlite to mine to add a little bit better drainage. So I'm just going to dump the potting mix into this 5-gallon bucket, and then I'm going to take this Miracle-Gro perlite and I'm just going to eyeball it and maybe add 1/4 of the volume or so as perlite. Maybe not even that much. Then simply mix it around. And the perlite doesn't break down, so what it does is it keeps a level of aeration in the soil. And when you do that, it will allow the water to run out of your cups faster, so you don't have an oversaturated medium, because when it comes to propagating fig cuttings, the #1 enemy is rot. And your cuttings will rot if your soil is too moist, because it usually does take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks for your cuttings to send roots if you're fortunate enough to have a good quality cutting. So I'm going to add a little bit more to that. I don't think that's enough. And you'll see that's what the final product looks like. Now, you don't have to use potting mix if you don't want. Some people use peat moss, some people use coco coir, some people like to make their own mix out of coir and peat moss and perlite and mulch, all kinds of other things. But I'm going to give this a shot and see how it works out. And now that my mix is made, what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare my cups. These are 18-ounce clear solo cups, and I went with clear so I could specifically watch the root development without having to pull the cuttings out of the container. So what you'll notice is these cups, they're made to hold water, not to leak. So you obviously have to install drain holes in each of these cups, or else water will not drain out and your cuttings will saturate and rot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a power drill with a very tiny pilot bit, and I'm going to drill a few holes in the bottom of all these cups. I'm probably going to put anywhere from 3 to 4 holes, and it's important that you start out with a very tiny pilot bit, because if you use one too large, it will crack your cups. Okay, now that the pilot holes have been drilled, I'm going to go over them with a larger drill bit and hone them out so I can get better drainage in the bottom of each cup. And here are all the cups that I drilled out. I put a 4-hole X pattern on each of them, and if you're curious what size drill bit I used, I wound up using a 1/4 inch drill bit. That's the final size. So each of those holes are 1/4 inch in diameter. Now, I do strongly recommend that if you want to use clear plastic cups like I'm using so you can monitor root development, you buy a good brand like Solo. Don't buy something that is going to that is very brittle and thin, that is going to crack when you drill through them, or they won't be usable. If you're going to do that, you may as well just use regular old nursery pots or buy those 4x9 square pots. They're great for cuttings, but you won't be able to monitor root development because they're opaque. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a black permanent marker, and we are going to put the name of the cutting as well as the date that we're doing the planting. So each of these cups need to be labeled for the appropriate cutting. All of my cups have been labeled and they're ready to be filled with soil. But before we do that, we want to do one more thing to our fig cuttings, and that is we want to score them roughly where we think the roots are going to grow out. So normally the roots are going to grow right where these little light bumps are, out of the base of the cutting at the node. But what we want to do is we want to take off some of the hardwood skin, and we want to expose the green cambium layer, because that green cambium layer, that's really where the roots are going to want to come out. So it's very helpful to do this. Now, in the pre-rooting method that I use, where I root them and I get nodes started in the paper towels, I didn't have to do this, but I think it's important when you're doing the direct potting method. And if you watch other people's figs videos, what they tend to do is they tend to take a pair of shears and they scrape off a whole bunch of the outer bark, and they expose that green cambium layer. And I tend to agree with Mike Kincaid. He's actually one of the first to mention this, so credit where credit's due. When you do that, you expose the insides to a greater chance of rot. So we don't really need to expose these big chunks of green. They're going to be sitting in a moist medium for a month. And if you give an entry point for anaerobic bacteria to come in and start composting these, that's never a good thing. So all we're going to do is we're going to take a clean pair of shears, and I did wash these in hot soapy water first, and we are going to just gently run the edge of the blade and just make like a hairline cut in a couple locations down at the bottom near the nodes that will be buried for them to grow roots. So here is our cutting. We are just going to take the blade, and we're just going to make a few little lines in there. And we're going to bring it basically over the node and all the way to the bottom. There you can see the hairline cut right there, and you can also see green exposed cambium layer. That is about the depth that you want to make the cut. So I've made cuts in the bottom of all of my different fig cuttings. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a few inches of my potting mix down in each of these cups. You need to have a few inches of a base for your cuttings to sit on. They can't just drop to the bottom of the cup. So I'm going to probably add about 2 to 3 inches in each of these cups and then compact it down. And here are all the cuttings. I made sure to put about 2 to 3 inches of soil in the bottom of each. Now, one thing that you do want to make sure is that the cuttings are not touching the bottom of the cup. There needs to be a buffer of soil, but it's always best to bury more than one node if possible. So for example, for this cutting right here, this node will be buried and this node will be buried in the cup. And that gives basically 2 chances, 2 different nodes that could spring roots. However, that's not always practical. If you look at this cutting right here, this long dudut was very vigorous. There's a huge separation from node to node, and that is it's just taller than the cup allows. So that's the problem with your fig trees growing too vigorously. When they grow very, very vigorously, you're only able to bury one node unless you get a large nursery pot or something like those big 32-ounce plastic cups, which I did not do. Now that we have the soil placed in each of the cups at about the right level, what we're going to do is we're going to use this product called Clonex rooting gel. And this is an optional step. You don't need this to make roots form at the nodes, but it's helpful to hedge your bets. There are many different products. There's Dip and Grow. There are rooting hormone powders. This is a gel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shake this up. And then I have this narrow double shot glass that I don't think I've ever used. So I'm going to put a little bit of the rooting hormone in this. And this is going to give me something to dip the cuttings in, rather than dip them in this and contaminate the container. So what I'm going to do is, at the bottom node for each of these cuttings, I'm going to take this and I'm just going to dip it in there and try to get that gel all over that node and where I made the cuts. And then let it drip off if it wants to. And then I'm going to place it right inside the soil. And I'm going to do that for every single one of these. And all of the cuttings have been dipped in Clonex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another cup full of my potting mix and I'm going to fill them up. And now that it's filled up, I'm going to center the cutting and gently push it down. Now, if you've noticed, I have not added water to this yet, and that is because a wet medium is much harder to work with. So all I'm going to do is with my finger tamp around the cutting to make sure that it's pretty stiff and in place, and then I'm going to water it in later. Okay, now all the fig cuttings have been potted up, but they have not yet been watered in. And I just realized that in my haste, I forgot to wrap the tops in parafilm. Here I have a little tiny roll of 1/2-inch parafilm. Others call it grafting tape. And the reason why people use parafilm is because the cuttings sometimes tend to dry out at the top. And if you look at these exposed tops right here, over time, because they have to sit dormant for so long while they try to root, sometimes the tops can wrinkle up and shrivel up. And it's especially prevalent when rooting dormant cuttings, because it tends to be so darn dry in indoor environments in the wintertime. And the lack of humidity can just shrivel them up. So what I'm going to do is, it's not too late to do this because I haven't watered them in yet. Ideally, you want to do it when it is just, when it's a cutting before you pot it up. But I'm just going to put a little bit of parafilm right above the top to keep them moist. So all I'm really going to do here is I'm going to take this piece of parafilm that I broke off, I'm just going to place it over the top, and then I'm going to gently wrap it around the top just to try and keep a little bit of the moisture in. Well, I don't really want to keep moisture in, I just want to keep it from drying out. There's a difference. You definitely want to make sure that your cuttings are dry when you do this. And again, this is so much easier to do in the beginning stages. And that's really all you need to do. Just press it on there. And that should hold moisture in on the top. And ideally, this bud will break through that little bit of parafilm. The one thing that you do want to do, though, is you want to check that top to make sure that there's no mold, anything fuzzy growing in there, and if that's the case, you're going to have to remove this parafilm. Alright, now that the parafilm is placed, I'm going to water them in with a watering can. And we're going to have to do this in a couple of steps because this potting medium has to percolate. So I'm going to let it sit there and drain for a minute, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to do another level of watering. And if this seems like a lot, I understand it may seem like a lot, but once I place these fig cuttings in my bin, I don't really intend to water them again. At least that's the plan. Here on my left, I have a high-walled sterilite container. It's 16.5 inches high. You can see the dimensions right here. And it was very important to me when doing this that I pick a container that is taller than the actual fig cuttings itself. And the reason why is because I want to create an environment with an average level of humidity. Now, a lot of people say that you don't need humidity for fig cuttings to root, and that is true. You don't need humidity for fig cuttings to root. Some people that use humidity domes and they keep in 80 to 90% humidity, that can create fungal issues, it can create fuzzy mold, and it can accelerate the rotting process. But the problem is, if you don't use any humidity at all, they're going to root in a very dry environment, and that can be problematic as well. Since it's so cold in most of the areas of the United States, it is not unusual for humidity to be around 20% in homes, and that is just not the environment that you want figs to root in. So we're at a crossroads where having humidity at 20% is no good, and having humidity at 80+% is problematic. So that's why I have this container right here, because I could put a lid on it if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. I want an open container, but I also want it to have a very high wall so it holds in a moderate amount of humidity. What I'm really going for here is about 40 to 50%, and I'm hoping this will create some kind of happy medium. And if I find out that it's letting too much humidity escape, it comes with a clear lid, so if I wanted to, I could place it on like this, or some orientation thereof where I can hold in some humidity but still let the water vapor out. And it was key for me to have a clear plastic lid, so if I ever did need to partially cover it, that way it'll still let the sunlight in. Now, the reason why I have these wood chips, these mini pine bark nuggets here, is that I want to put a several inch thick layer of the mini pine bark nuggets on the bottom of my container. And I saw this on Mike Kincaid's video and I thought it was brilliant, because what I had a problem with last year is both the tops of my fig cuttings and the bottom where I drilled my air holes drying out. So I'd have to overwater the cuttings in order to get the bottoms to stay a little moist and the tops to stay a little moist. The centers would become saturated. So if I put a thick layer of mulch down on the bottom to control the moisture, it'll hold the moisture in the bottom, and then I'll also be able to mulch the tops. And hopefully, if the top mulch dries out and if the bottom mulch dries out, it'll keep the cup overall in an even level of moisture. So here I have a few inches of mulch in the bottom of this container, and then I'm also going to place just a little bit of water in there, just because I want that mulch to absorb something, and I want it to stay a little bit moist. And I'm not going to place my cuttings just yet because I really want that water to absorb in, because I just want this to be lightly damp, lightly moist, not actually wet. Alright, here's our plastic bin full of slightly damp wood chips. They're not wet, but they are damp. And here you can see what my fig cuttings look like since I added the water to them. They've since become reasonably saturated. I would say they're probably wetter than I'd like them to be, but again, I never want to have to water these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place these all throughout this bin. Here's another one so you can see what it looks like. And I promise you it's not quite as wet as it seems. If I shake it around, this is a really fast draining mix, so I'm not really all that concerned. And that's what they're going to look like in the bin. Then I'm going to take the rest of these wood chips and I'm going to fill in the gaps and also cover the containers. So what I want to do here is I want to keep an even level of moisture. And I think it's going to take a little bit of shuffling to get all of these pine bark chips in there comfortably. But the goal is to basically insulate all of the cuttings against each other and create an environment where there's going to be minimal evaporation and everything stays evenly moist throughout the use of this container. Alright, this is what the final product looks like here. So I'm going to give this a little bit of a spin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these upstairs. And these fig cuttings are probably a little wetter than I would like them to be. And they're probably wetter than most of the people watching this video are used to. But I'm not going to keep these at a very high temperature. The upstairs, I don't keep the heat on very high during the winter. I usually only keep the house at about 69 degrees. Then usually in the upstairs it'll go up to be about 74 degrees during the day, and then it drops down to maybe about 68, 69 because I turn the upstairs heat in my office off during the night. So because the temperatures are fairly cool, they shouldn't be an environment that'll promote lots of rot, and hopefully this will be a nice slow rooting process. Here we are in my office and it's a very comfortable 72 degrees. So if you'll notice, the fig cuttings are right here, and I also have a heat mat that is right here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the fig cuttings and I'm going to place them on the heat mat. So today is November 21st. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to not touch these fig cuttings at all, not even look at them, not disturb them in any way, shape, or form for 30 days. So it's November 21st. I want to do a follow-up video on December 21st, and we will see how these progress. Fig cuttings like to be disturbed as little as possible. They don't want to be touched. The other thing is these fig cuttings are not in any kind of direct light. The window is totally opposite this side of the office. There are no windows over here, so at no point will this be bathed in light. It will only get the indirect light when the sun rises in the day. And this is very important because it's very important that your roots grow before any buds or leaf growth happens. Inside your fig cutting there are stored sugars, and if buds and leaves grow before the roots start to grow, the buds and the leaves will start exhausting the internal food supply that is inside that cutting. Now, it's okay for the leaves and the buds to feed off that internal food supply if the fig trees grow roots, because then the roots can siphon energy out of the soil and you can begin fertilizing them and giving them supplemental nutrients. However, if roots do not grow and buds start to break and greenery starts to manifest, you're going to be in big trouble because you're going to exhaust the internal food supply of that cutting and they are eventually going to shrivel up. So that's why we want to keep them in relative darkness away from the sun, because the sun will cause the buds to swell and break and force them to bloom. That's why direct sunlight is the enemy of your cuttings until you have a strong root system. That's also why we have bottom heat. It's important to keep the bottoms of the cups warmer than the tops because you want there to be more hormonal stimulation on the bottom of the cutting. You want the cutting to put its energy into growing roots, not growing buds and green growth at this stage. And keeping the bottom warm means you're keeping the metabolic rate higher at the bottom where the roots form than at the top. So this method of rooting fig cuttings is a little bit different than I did last year, so this is a little bit of an experiment for me. So we'll see how it performs in 30 days. Everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. If you found it helpful, please hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe for future updates and more videos like these. If you're interested in anything that I used in this video or in my garden in general, please look at the link to the Amazon storefront in the video description below. Everything I use is in my Amazon storefront. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all again next time.